November 9th, that's today, is World Adoption Day, and it's a global celebration of family values aimed at raising awareness for families that are contemplating the adoption journey. Now, it's the 6th year. Tens of thousands of people from around the world have marked this day by drawing smiley faces on their palms and sharing it on social media. The day comes as global adoption rates have been declining, meaning that many more children could end up in youth centers, for instance. The process of adopting a child in South Africa is extremely complex and can take years. The Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria says more research is needed to determine how adoption has worked out for the children involved. In fact, the center's director is Karabo Oza, and she joins us now live via our video link in Pretoria. Karabo, thanks very much for making time to chat to us on this important day, on this important issue. Great to have you on the AM report. It might be an obvious question, but it's an important one as a start. How would you describe the purpose of adoption? What would you say the purpose of adoption is?
Thank you for having me. So, the purpose of adoption is to provide a home for a child who doesn't have a family, who most of the time will be abandoned, children who, if you don't put them up for adoption or they don't get adopted by families, may end up in other forms of alternative care, which one you've already mentioned, which is living in a child and youth care center, which we know is not a setup that's homely and means that the child will be just one child amongst maybe sometimes even hundreds of children in that child and youth care center. So the starting point is that you actually have children that unfortunately things did not work out for them, or they've been abandoned by their families, by their biological families, and now you have a process through which you can find an alternative home, or another possibility at a family and a home for them.
And I'll tell you why I asked this question, Karabo, is because the Children's Act actually speaks of a child being adoptable. What does that mean?
Yes, it's a very important process, because either parents can, a parent can decide, I'm going to give my child up for adoption. I can't cope. The father has left me, and as a young mother, I'm giving up a child for adoption. And then there's a provision in the Children's Act that says that you must look at whether a child is adoptable. That includes where a parent has given consent. That will be children who have been abandoned and you cannot find any other family members. So the Act tells you when you would be able to say, well, this child is adoptable. And the Children's Court has to actually go through that process before they can then do the process where the child is ultimately adopted.
It's interesting because in the background we're seeing that adoption rates are actually on the decline. In most instances we want to attribute these sort of things to something like the COVID-19 pandemic. But I'm interested to find out from you how much of that decline can be attributable to the law in its current form. Is the law, in other words, helpful in ensuring that children who want to be adopted or people who want to adopt children can do exactly that?
So, yes, we can at this stage really say that COVID-19 has led to the decline. The decline in South Africa and worldwide has been coming before the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's for various reasons. So we have the Children's Act, which regulates both domestic and inter-country or international adoptions. With domestic law, our provisions are very enabling. They're very clear in terms of what a person must do to comply with. The challenge that people face in relation to domestic adoption would be that the process sometimes takes a bit long, because you have to do all the checks and balances, and then after that is done, there's a process through which the Department of Social Development must give a letter saying, okay, we've looked at this, you can proceed then with the adoption. And we found in the last few years that there have been incidences where that process stalls for various reasons. We did a big case in KwaZulu-Natal last year where the process was stalling because there was a panel of people who must approve and issue those letters, and they were just not sitting to do that, or they would postpone. And in the meantime, cases of children were pending for a long time in the Children's Court. So not necessarily the law being the problem, but the implementation of it. And this is a chronic thing in South Africa. Our laws are always, the best, aimed to protect children. But when it comes to implementation, there's always the human being behind, who then, sometimes becomes the person who creates the challenge.
In most instances, we've learned that part of that lax behavior is because people are trying to protect certain interests. There's always some kind of motive behind it. Would you say that's the same in the case of adoption? Are people dragging their feet because, I don't know, they stand to benefit in some way, or trying to protect some process from getting underway?
Well, no, I mean, I think we can't say that there's anybody who benefits really greatly from the process of adoption. The one thing that we know is a critical challenge, and I think I flagged it in the short article I wrote last week, is the fact that there's an obligation to try and place children with extended families before you really go to adoption. But the problem is that has now been interpreted in a way that means that, some people in the Department of Social Development will take 3 years, 2 years trying to find a great-grandmother or a great-aunt who they want to place a child with in order to preserve the biological link, which serves a very important purpose. However, in the meantime, the child then is in legal limbo because they're either in a child and youth care center or they're with the person who wants to adopt them, but they're not formally in that person's care, which is not actually ideal for children. So there's a need for balance in relation to how far are we going to try and find extended family members who can take the child in, versus then saying, you know what, it's not working, this child must just then be made available for adoption, and then you proceed with that process. So, and I don't think anybody benefits from that. If anything, the children lose out if we drag out that process. But if we did it quickly and we did find that there are sometimes family members that are willing to and suitable, not just willing, and suitable to take care of the child, then you would place the child with the person. But also to link with that, there's another complication that comes in that we've also seen, and this is where young mothers have given consent for their children to be adopted, to be given up for adoption, and then the department comes in and says, well, but we must go tell your parents that you had a child, and they try and find all the extended family members against the wishes of the biological mother, and again, they're well-meaning because they're trying to keep the child within the family, but then that creates a tension between the consent of that woman who gave birth to the child, who says, maybe my extended family is not good enough for my child. I don't want my child to go there, child formally, versus now, the department's idea of wanting a child to be in extended family by hook or crook, kind of, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and to be fair, I can see where the department's coming from with this, because one would expect inevitably once the child grows older and they realize that they are adopted, the immediate question becomes, where is my biological family? Why was I given up for adoption, etc., etc.? How much of a challenge does that become for children who don't have cultural ties but have been given to another family?
I totally agree with you, and we all agree with that family is the first and best solution for all the children. What I wanted to say, though, is that I think we haven't done enough in South Africa to track whether the domestic adoptions that have happened since we allowed adoptions, whether they work out for children. So we need to find out, how did it work out for the family, how did it work out, more importantly, for the child, for us to be able to say either way whether adoption is good or not. But I must also say that one of the things that we need to guard against is also stigmatizing and being secretive about things like adoption, because the law allows for an open adoption where a child can be adopted and still have a means of slowly and always knowing that they have a biological family. Now, that's more obvious when you have interracial adoptions, but when you have adoptions that are not interracial, you may find that people are more inclined to be secretive. International law approaches and even psychologists here locally always encourage that you start telling a child from as little as 5 in relation to their story of adoption and how they ended up in your family, so that they don't get a shock when they are in their 14, 15, or 16, because one way or the other, children always find out. Whether you tell them or most of the time you find out, other people sort of whisper it to them, or indirectly they always have this feeling that, I don't really look like these people. I don't really look like my dad or my mom, and so there's a need for that balance. And as I say, it's not the first option, adoption, and we all prefer family. But it's a great option where all else has failed. But we must make sure that it's obviously there's safeguards. But we need to do this follow-up work where we support other families that have adopted children, where we follow up and see whether children have coped with how they've adjusted into the families that they've been adopted into, so that we can know whether one day we may take the stance of, well, maybe adoption is not good for children, because internationally some countries have taken that stance, but they've done research that supports why is it that from their perspective they don't want adoptions to continue in their countries anymore.
Yeah, and I guess the question then becomes, what becomes the alternative if we, hypothetically speaking, decide to do away with adoption? But, as we run down our conversation, Karabo, today is World Adoption Day. In fact, it's the springboard for our conversation. What would you reckon specifically people in South Africa should be thinking about insofar as adoption is concerned on a day like this?
Well, I mean, I really think people should consider it as an option, as a way for them to help a child who all else has failed for them, and to give them an opportunity at a better life. Because the other alternative, especially where we can't find family members, extended families, is that children will end up in child and youth care centers, where we know research has shown that that is actually not the best option for children, to end up in these children's home and child and youth care centers for the whole adulthood.
All right.
I mean, for the whole childhood, and that affects the adulthood, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's certainly an important conversation, one which we could speak about ad nauseum. We're going to have to leave it there, at least for now. Really appreciate your time and for coming on to the AM Report. Karabo Oza is Director of the Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria, helping us remember some of the salient issues insofar as adoption is concerned, as the globe marks today World Adoption Day.